Hey guys, welcome to the View from the U. I'm Mike Carlson.
And I'm Brian Hasenbuttle.
Brian, another huge week. Rivalry Week Part 2, the sequel. So why don't you get us started with some top 25 conversation?
Alright, top 25. Now, Mike, we're filming this on Sunday at 3 o'clock, so the standings haven't come out yet. What I'm going to do for a change, since I've been so displeased with how the standings have looked, I'm going to put out my own top 25. Alright, number 1, Florida State. Obviously, I mean, they're the obvious choice. You don't really have a better combination of a difficult record that they've overcome and also being undefeated. Number 2, Auburn Tigers. I mean, there's been huge debate. I mean, I bet Ohio State's going to get number 2, but if you look at it, they've played 6 top 25 opponents. They've won 5 of those games, I'm pretty sure. Maybe 1 or 2 off, but still they have a huge win against Alabama and Texas A&M. And they've really just stepped up. All right, but moving on, number 3, Mizzou. All right, I'm pushing Ohio State way down, but Mizzou, of course, a bad kick away from possibly being undefeated. I mean, they're gonna go to the SEC championship, and this is a team that really hasn't fallen short at all this season, except for, of course, the South Carolina game, which, of course, was debatable. But on the other side of the coin, I have Ohio State at number 4. Because, I mean, you have to look at the other side of the Mizzou token. While Mizzou was a bad kick away from being undefeated, Ohio State was a failed 2-point conversion away from losing a game and then being kicked from the BCS conversation. And my problem with that, I actually got into an argument with a friend of mine last night over whether or not Auburn or Auburn or Ohio State should be number 2 and go and get the national championship bid. And it's just my one problem is that there's so many counter-arguments against Ohio State. You know, they gave up 20 against Buffalo. They gave up 35 against Illinois. They played poorly against Cal and Northwestern and Michigan. And I'm just not sold on this team being a top opponent, and I'll definitely be watching them with another huge test against Michigan State in the Big Ten Championship. Moving on, number 5, Alabama. I mean, tough loss for Nick Saban and his Crimson Tide, but you can't deny that they're 11-1, and they are still one of the best programs in the country. Number 6, Oklahoma State, and this is a team that really has proved themselves recently, especially with Baylor, and not really showing any signs of falling, and I do think they're going to beat Oklahoma next week. Number 7, South Carolina. They really proved themselves to me against Clemson last week, especially since Clemson's been seen so highly. And after losing to Georgia, I wasn't sure about this team, but they definitely proved themselves. Number 8 is Stanford. Again, just edging Notre Dame, which we'll talk about later this episode, Mike. But they do have that position at number 8. Number 9, Michigan State. They're riding an 8-game win streak, and I do believe these guys need to get more credit, especially since I'm pulling for them to upset Ohio State and give Auburn a BCS bid. And number 10, Baylor. I mean, Mike, I know you like these Bears, but they won by 3 against TCU. They're sort of waning after this Oklahoma State hangover. But moving on from that, 11, Arizona State. I mean, obviously one of the best teams in the Pac-12, if not the best team. I wouldn't be opposed to them getting a Rose Bowl bid because they've earned it. Number 12, I have Oregon there. I mean, they pulled it out in the Civil War, but they're not going to be a top 10 team, and they shouldn't. Number 13, Mike, your team, Northern Illinois. Great job for them finishing the undefeated season, and they deserve that 13 spot. Number 14, I'm dropping Clemson down to 14 because they've had their big games, but they haven't won them. Their 2 big games, of course, being South Carolina and Florida State, and just not really playing up to what we imagined Clemson would be in those games. So it really begs the question, they're sort of like the Kansas City Chiefs. They were undefeated, and then they played the Broncos and lost. And this team, they've won all their easy games, but they just haven't shown up in the clutch, really tough games. But moving on, 15, LSU. And I do think these guys should move up. They're still a very good team, even though they've had their tough losses, of course, beating Johnny Manziel and Texas A&M. But 16, Oklahoma. There's a very okay team. They're exactly what you'd expect of an Oklahoma team, just not going above and beyond. 17, I have UCLA. And this team sort of, again, written off after losing to Arizona State, but I do think they deserve a high ranking, especially after a huge win against USC. 18 Duke. I mean, I do think these guys should have moved up more because I think they should have been earlier. But going to the ACC championship where they will be walloped by Florida State. These guys just had a fantastic season. I have so much respect for David Cutcliffe, and that's where they should go. Now, number 19, here might be a surprise, Texas. They're a 3-loss team. There are very few 3-loss teams left, but I mean, they got it done big time against Texas Tech. And the reason they were ousted after losing to Oklahoma State is because they lost, so they had to be ousted. But this is a team that is very much, I still think, a top 25 program. So number 20, Wisconsin, tough loss to Penn State. That's something you never like to see in a big program that was making a run for a BCS bowl. But that's unfortunately what has to happen. 21, I have Louisville. I mean, they're still, I guess, an okay team. They haven't really had a huge loss except against UCF, but that's sort of where they need to go. 22, I have Miami. I mean, they're playing well. They just had a resounding win against Pitt, and they're still a team that doesn't have very many losses, and they lost to some really good teams like Duke and Florida State, so they really should be in the conversation. Number 23, I think it should be UW. They had a great win against Washington State last week. Again, they're a 4-loss team, but this is a team that can really run with the big dogs. Their losses are to Oregon, Stanford, USC and not USC, Arizona State and UCLA. 4 fantastic teams, and they've won everywhere else, so I don't understand why they're not in the conversation. 24, I have Virginia Tech. I mean, they had a bad loss to Maryland 2 weeks ago, but this is still a very good team with an unstoppable defense. Actually, defense aren't unstoppable. They stop everything. But either way, they're still only a 4-loss team. I mean, they got it done in the big games, especially against my Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, to earn them their first top 25 bid. And these guys really do need another chance. And 25, Mike, your Trojans. USC, even though they lost to UCLA, they're still a very good team that needs to go to a good bowl because they are awesome. And
yeah, I totally agree with you, Brian, and I love the top 25. I love that you have Auburn at number 2 because I have been absolutely just pushing to have Auburn at number 2 since they had that game yesterday against Alabama. More on that later. That was a kind of a big game if you watched it. So I think that Auburn, they deserve to be number 2. I feel like if you're out of the top 25 and you beat the number 1 team, then we're not going to put you in the top. You're not even going to be number 1. When you're that close, when you're 4-1 and when 3 spots separate you, and you beat the number 1 team, I deserve that you at least to become the number 2 team. Ohio State they haven't been great this year. They've played in a very easy Big Ten, a very depleted Big Ten. I feel like if they play in the Big Ten of 5 years ago, we might have another story. We might have a different story on our hands here, different top 25. But the Big Ten, I mean, it's Michigan State and Ohio State right now. Those are the 2 powerhouses, and Ohio State's going to match up against Michigan State in the Big Ten championship. So we're going to get to see that. But I firmly believe that Auburn deserves to be number 2 because they beat Alabama, and when you beat the best, Brian, you deserve to be somewhat close. Florida State's been there all year, so they get in because they've been there all year. They've done it all. They've played it. They've won all the big games. Jameis Winston's their quarterback. Of course, they deserve to be number 2, but I think that if Auburn and Ohio State play right now, Auburn beats Ohio State, and I think that Auburn just deserves to be in that number 2 spot.
Yeah, and another one of the huge problems I have with Ohio State is that, it's easy to judge like a conference based on out of conference play, but if you look at Ohio State, they've played FCS teams and MAC teams and a whole bunch of like really small conference teams. And the only major conference opponent out of conference they've played is Cal. I mean, such an underachieving Bears team. I just don't have proof that they can win out of conference against teams like Florida State, who they might be matched up against after giving up 40-plus points to Michigan and not really proving themselves against a major conference team other than the Cal Bears.
Yeah, and I think that you look at last week's near nuclear collapse against Michigan. You point to that. This is a Michigan team, Brian. If you're Ohio State, you have to go in there, take care of business. That's the professional term for it. You go in there, You take care of business. You get out. You don't play down to your opponents. You don't let them play up to your level. You just go in there. You get it done. You go. And they did not do that. This game was a lot closer than it needed to be against a very, very bad Michigan team. This is a Michigan team that earlier in the year finished a game with negative rushing yards. I mean, if you're Ohio State and you expect to be in that BCS, if you even want to be in the conversation, I expect you to blow that team out. That team is below you, and Florida State's done that. They have. They've got the cupcakes and they've devoured them. They've destroyed, any of those cupcake games. They haven't had a close one in a long time. But Ohio State to have those cupcake games against Michigan, you got to go in there. You just got to get it done. You have to. You got to take care of business, make it clean, and just go.
Yeah, especially since if Florida State wins by a larger margin against Clemson than you win against Cal, that really begs the question: are you really good enough to play against a team like this?
Yeah, I mean, you got to ask the question: can you even hang with Ohio? Can you even hang with Florida State? I mean, if you can barely hang with Michigan, and it comes down to a 2-point conversion, and the likes of Devin Gardner and Fitzgerald Toussaint are burning you, then you're going to be in trouble against Jameis Winston. I mean, he will run over you all day.
Especially since, the national championship takes no prisoners. If you look at Notre Dame last year, they had a whole bunch of wins that proved that they were good enough to be a number 2 or number 1 seed. But, still they couldn't hang with this Alabama team. So Ohio State hasn't even done step 1. So how are they even going to have a prayer of hanging with Florida State in the national championship?
Exactly. And Braxton Miller, he did not play as well as I thought he was going to play. His passing was very lackluster. Thankfully his rushing game saved this Buckeye attack, but he's been very lackluster, Brian. He has not been the Braxton Miller that we saw last year. So it's going to be interesting. The poll comes out tonight, the AP poll. I checked that this morning. They did have Ohio State at that number 2 spot, with Florida State obviously in that number 1 spot, and then Auburn was 3 and Alabama was 4. But yeah, I gotta believe, Brian, if you're the BCS right now and you're a numbers cruncher, you gotta have Auburn ahead of Ohio State.
Yeah. So, Mike, with that being said, take it away with your game for this episode.